Right, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to the meeting. Could I ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions, and any members of the public that might like to follow is at London Assembly on Twitter using the hashtag AssemblyFire for the meeting. So Laura, are there any apologies?
No apologies, Chairman. We are expecting some new member Cooper.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other declarations that we can note other than listed? No, thank you. Can we note the revised terms of reference for the committee?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can we agree the minutes of the committee meeting on the 17th of May?
Agreed.
Can we note the completed and ongoing actions?
Yep.
Good, thank you, which brings us to our main item today. I have spoken to you all separately, but I will say publicly, if at any point any of you feel compromised by any of the questions because of the Grenfell inquiry, please do say so, and we will move away and respect your thoughts on that. So if I can welcome the guest, Nick Coombe, Strategic Technical Advisor to the London Fire Brigade, Lynsey Seal, Head of Fire Engineering, London Fire Brigade, Dan Daly, Assistant Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade, John O'Neill, OBE, Managing Director of Fire Protection Association, Dr. Jim Lockling, Technical Director of Fire Protection Association, and Gary Strong, Global Building Standards Director, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. So welcome all. Right, okay, we're going to go through various sections asking questions. So if I may start, I'll start if I can address this to the London Fire Brigade. Can you briefly outline what regular checks and inspections the Fire Brigade undertakes to assess fire safety in London's high-rise residential buildings? Do you want to start, Dan?
Absolutely. So we carry out a proactive programme of building inspections throughout the year. About a quarter of the premises that we see in an annual cycle will be purpose-built blocks of flats, which will range from anything from 6 floors upwards, and including some buildings below that height as well. So within the overall programme last year, we delivered around about 12,500 inspections. And they are to premises in London and for the areas of those buildings that are used in common and covered by the RRO. So we would be assessing those for the general fire precautions within the building, equally for the access and facilities for firefighters to ensure firefighter safety should they need to attend those buildings. In terms of the work specifically around high-rise since Grenfell Tower, we've carried out around 1,500 activities in high-rise buildings. We have looked at about 740 individual premises and carried out around 1,100 visits to those affected blocks that have had ACM cladding and issues with the fire precautions in those buildings. I think the common things that we tend to find would be issues with the compartmentation within those buildings, issues affecting the means of escape, the suitability and sufficiency of the fire risk assessments for those premises, issues with fire doors, firefighting lifts and the smoke control and ventilation systems within those buildings. And they will be to varying degrees across that portfolio of premises. In terms of the action that we'd look to take, much of this will be resolved through what we call goodwill advice, where at the time advice to the RP for the building, responsible person for the building, will ensure that those measures are taken and put in place to bring that building within a compliant range. But more enforceable action around notices of deficiencies, which will list out works to be carried out over a period of time. And moving on from that, we'd issue enforcement notices, which would require works to be undertaken with a prescribed period of time, which will be followed up by our inspecting officers.
You've mentioned quite a few things that you found that are incorrect there. Have you been surprised going around that you found so many different aspects to fire safety that are clearly of concern?
I don't think those things are a surprise to us. I think one of the things that we've set out in our last London safety plan was that we wanted to have the ability with our inspecting officers to be more intrusive at times where we felt the need to look a bit deeper under the skin of the building, which isn't part of what we would normally do in terms of the audit process. And I think in upping now our inspection regime, enhancing that inspection regime, that has enabled us to reveal some issues that we might not have done otherwise. So I don't think they're surprising areas. There are areas that we would come across in other types of buildings as well as purpose-built blocks of flats.
Okay, I mean, we were concerned because after Grenfell tower blocks in Camden were found to have had more than 1,000 fire doors that were either missing or not adequate. And the fire door issue is completely down to the local authority as landlord. But I mean, on that scale, it's pretty scary, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the issue for us when it comes to flat front doors is whether or not we can actually access the doors to check them, whether the doors sit within or without outside the RRO. So inside the flat, the demise inside clearly isn't our territory, and there are issues there around compartmentation that can affect the general fire precautions in the building that we don't always have access to with our inspecting officers. And they're things that we're hoping to be able to drive through under the Hackett review and clear up the overlap, if you like, and those areas where we want clarification for who has responsibility for ensuring those measures are in place. I think when we look at Camden, we were working in, if you like, a new consciousness post-Grenfell and a new set of awareness really around the issues that we needed to look at. And with the cooperation of the local authority, we were able to gain access to more of that building and reveal some of those issues that might not have otherwise been picked up.
Do you think people are more alive to the fact that there, you know, these omissions all over the place are more serious than perhaps they would have thought pre-Grenfell?
I think certainly people's responsibilities, they're more aware of those. And I think we're, you know, in terms of where we're trying to be more intrusive or taking a more in-depth approach and moving more to an inspection regime rather than an audit regime, I think that has enabled us to reveal more of what's going on under the skin of the building, I think.
Andrew?
Just a quick one, Dan. You can only inspect common parts.
Yep.
That's right. The other question you're going to put on the back of that is, you've talked about adaptations to buildings that you've been inspected. As a ballpark figure, what proportion of the buildings you've inspected have had alterations or amendments or whatever that compromise fire safety?
It's really difficult to actually answer in
I know
terms
it's
of
going to
that.
be a difficult question to say.
Yeah,
ballpark
I mean,
figure.
where those adaptations take place, I think if we look at the average leaseholder or tenant within a block of flats, they could carry out any number of alterations within the building that could have some impact on the general fire precautions of the building. And those things we wouldn't have access to check. So I think it's a difficult one to actually put a ballpark figure on.
On common parts?
In common parts, I don't know if there's any. Nick's got more extensive experience as an IO, an officer in fire safety. Maybe you.
Yeah, it's difficult to collect that data, but obviously over any lifetime cycle of a building, there will be changes to that building, and it's up to the responsible person to ensure that that is maintained to the current standard. I think that's the issue we have. There's been issues where people have not understood their responsibilities, and in some cases procured maybe unsuitable fire safety equipment for their building, and that's our role to assist in ensuring that the public are safe. One of the examples that Dan talked about is we didn't previously test some of the smoke control systems and firefighting lifts because it's up to the RP to ensure compliance. They might demonstrate that through paperwork, but on our intrusive inspection we did post-Grenfell, we actually physically tested it. And that's where we found the issues that although they had paper evidence, they actually didn't work in reality.
Okay, how does the London Fire Brigade currently intervene in building design and construction, and how has this changed over recent years?
If, okay, Lynsey?
I'm happy to answer that. Under the current system, London Fire Brigade is a statutory consultee as part of the building regulations process, which occurs after the planning phase and during the detailed design phase before the construction should commence. Our involvement is in relation to our capacity as the ultimate enforcing authority for the fire safety legislation once the building is occupied. The stage at which we are consulted is when the approving authority, which could be a local authority building control or an approved inspector, is satisfied that the designs are in compliance with the building regulations. We will then be invited to make comments on any matters which the applicant may need to address prior to the occupation. So it's a parallel application, so they're satisfying the building regulations for the approving authority and also any fire safety matters once the building is complete. What we can also do through that process is offer any observations on any matters relating to the building regulations, which we tend to do for things like firefighting, access and facilities. At present, we're not a statutory consultee at planning stage, and nor are we ordinarily involved at the completion stage of a building. We would certainly welcome a change whereby we would be involved at the planning stage of a building, particularly for more complex projects, which is where we can probably have a lot more influence on the ultimate design of the building.
Given though that there are so many planning applications going through, obviously there would be a resource issue there. Can you cope with that within current staffing, etc.?
So we would want to be involved in the more complex projects, and at the moment we do that under a goodwill advice process for the major projects that are going on in London. We would certainly need to look at the criteria of which projects we do and don't get involved in. But at planning stage, this is where a lot of the things in relation to firefighting access are set and very difficult to change further down the design process as it develops.
If I could just add to that, there's a potential danger that we look to the fire service to provide a stopgap for competencies in other areas around planning and design. And I think we do have an important role, and we sort of welcome that enhanced role that's been offered through the Hackett Review. But there are resource issues, and they're not simply matters of money. It's around skills and competencies, availability of suitably qualified people, and those pressures are there in industry. They're there for us as a fire service as well. So I think it's important that we look at the whole system of change and make sure the levels of competency in all those areas are there to support proper design and planning and put safety at the forefront of all planning and building design.
Are you actually doing any work on modelling what that would cost if you did, if you were asked to intervene earlier or given a view earlier? Have you modelled? I
think at this stage it's about working out exactly what the ask would look like in terms of what buildings may come through, as Lynsey's alluded to, the more complex sort of designs, and there's a difficulty in determining at the moment what that ask looks like. And I think once we are able to bottom out what those complex buildings look like and how many of those we may receive, then we'll be able to do some planning around what resource implications might mean and our ability to meet the demand.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, if I can bring you into the next part. Do you agree with the measures set out in the Mayor's draft London plan to introduce fire safety to the planning process? So who would like to start? John.
Yes, we do. We welcome a far more joined-up approach. I mean, I think there is an issue about resources, and as Dana says, there's an issue about competency throughout the industry, and I'm very, very pleased that Hackett has brought it up. The difficulty that we've got and the fight there is between the Mayor's plan and some of the aspects of Hackett is that Hackett wants to go for a less prescriptive approach, and we've given evidence to various committees within the London Assembly before about your approach to sprinklers, for example. She wants to go to a far more performance-based approach, whilst recognising there is a real problem with competency within the industry, particularly in the engineering disciplines. And so I think we've got to be very, very careful that we strike a balance, and there's got to be a planned timetable. It's quite disappointing that a year after Grenfell and some months after Hackett has responded, we still haven't got an announcement of a building regulations review in the United Kingdom or in England. We've got one in Scotland now. And we still have no detailed response to what the government's planning to do on Hackett. And my understanding is we're probably not going to get that until November.
Dr. Jim, if you
I have nothing to add to that.
Just on that point, actually, I mean, the Hackett review is out for consultation, so it's to the end of July for all of us to respond to that. And I think everybody is busily talking to colleagues just now before the meeting started. We're all responding to putting in our response to Hackett, and a few of us actually sat on the Hackett work groups as well. So we had quite a big hand actually in drafting what came through in the final recommendations, which I think largely we support. Although there was obviously disappointment that it didn't go far enough, perhaps in some areas, like for example, outright ban of combustible cladding. But I think Lynsey and myself, we sat on the design, construction, refurbishment work group for Hackett, and we welcomed the early involvement of the fire rescue services at the planning stage. We thought that was absolutely essential, actually, to have early involvement in the design at planning stage. So we do support that.
Okay, has anybody got anything else to add?
The only thing, just one thing, just to understand, we are consulted on, doesn't mean they listen to what we say. I think that needs to be clear.
Was that the case, though?
No, that is the case sometimes, yes. Yeah. So they have to consult with us, but they don't have to listen to what we say, which is an issue that Dame Judith Hackett has come out and said that we need to be listened to more. So that's a positive thing as far as we're concerned.
Okay. Colleagues, have you got any questions on this? No? Okay, so we'll now go to fire safety post-Grenfell with my colleague.
Yeah, I'll probably start with Dan. What immediate actions were taken post-Grenfell to ensure the safety of high-rise buildings and I suppose by extension the people who live in them?
Absolutely. So there was a rapid programme of building inspections put in place, as you know, and that asked principally, whilst it was a national challenge, it principally fell to London. I think we probably saw about 85% of that demand fall to London Fire Brigade. The measures that we put in place was to pull together a team of inspecting officers with some additional support and input from technical officers at the centre and the fire engineering team to ensure that we were able to go and do a more deep dive inspection rather than an audit that we would normally do of those buildings to identify issues. Crews were also, operational crews from local stations were also sent on those inspections to check the facilities for firefighter safety and for fighting a fire in the event of an incident at those buildings. We also increased the...
Sorry, I can't hear.
We also increased the predetermined attendance for high-rise buildings to provide some public reassurance around our attendance and our ability to deal with those incidents.
What was the PDA change?
We moved to 8 pumping appliances where we had more than 4 calls to a high-rise building, and there's a secondary attendance where if the caller gave information around the external facade of the building potentially being involved, then 10 pumping appliances. Also the addition of an aerial appliance.
What was it before?
Before that we sent 4 appliances.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
No. So in terms of the work around high-rise, as I say, we did over 1,500 high-rise related activities with buildings, around 1,100 visits across 740 premises that were identified to us, largely from social residential, but it did include some hospital premises as well within that initial tranche. The initial inspection was around the general fire precautions. When we then had confirmation around the cladding type on those buildings, if it was confirmed as ACM 3 or 2, the more serious or more concerning types of cladding arrangements, we then undertook re-inspections to make sure interim measures had been put in place and the advice of competent persons had been sought by the RP. In many cases, the work involved us liaising with the RP on behalf of the building owners and ensuring that public safety had been fully addressed in terms of mitigating the risk to residents from fire. We've seen a huge increase in the numbers of inquiries from members of the public through our advice lines seeking reassurance, and so there's been, on the back of that work around property and regulatory safety, we've done an inordinate amount of work around community reassurance and safety as well. So there's been a number of initiatives, not just within the local community around Kensington and Chelsea, but also across London to reassure people around the Know Your Plan and the advice for residents living in purpose-built blocks of flats.
So 2 things that come out of that for me. One is how far you're getting around privately owned blocks. I mean, if they're owned by the local authority or housing association, they're more obviously known to you, but a lot of privately owned blocks, both residential and non-residential, how are you getting on with those?
Seen a bit of movement in that recently. It has been slow compared to the social sector. We've currently got in excess of 200 buildings that we now have programmed in for inspections that are private ownership. And they are buildings that at this stage we believe may have ACM cladding, but we don't yet have confirmation around any test results for some of those buildings. There's a small number of privately owned blocks that were in that initial tranche of work that we did as well. Some of those blocks came to light because they also had elements of social housing within them. And that would be one of the reasons we got those earlier, if you like. So there is still some work to be done. I don't feel we've got the full picture yet of privately owned buildings across London. There are some initiatives around a multi-agency task force as well to see if we can work with local authorities to support them in getting those buildings tested and then understanding what that risk looks like and whether interim measures are required in those premises. So
what proportion of private blocks do you think you've not reached yet?
It's really difficult. I'd love to be able to tell you exactly what the number is across London, but I don't think there is a definitive data set that I could draw from and then tell you whether or not what percentage we have. I think that's been one of the major difficulties we've faced, and I would say it's not just a London difficulty. The data quality that we've been trying to work with has been really taxing and trying and brought with it a huge amount of work as well in order to drill through that to understand what the ask is. You know, we've taken that on, and I think we're getting there.
It's a known unknown then.
Yes, I suppose that's one way of putting it, Andrew.
And then you mentioned advice to residents.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously that's been quite controversial
Yep.
in relation to the fires. I'm not going to ask about the advice for Grenfell, but more generally, have you changed advice to residents and in what circumstances and what advice are you now giving?
So our general advice remains the same. Stay put is the advice that we give to people in residential blocks of flats, purpose-built blocks of flats, and that hasn't changed, and we've reiterated that and been quite strong on that. We go to many high-rise fires across London each year, and in the vast majority of those cases, residents elsewhere in the building are unaware that a fire has taken place, and that's when the reliability of that building is there, and we don't have those concerns. So we have had, through the inspection programme, a number of buildings where we've put in place interim measures which include a wake-in watch, and in those instances those buildings have moved on a temporary basis to a simultaneous evacuation strategy, and that's because we have concerns around the ACM compromising the compartmentation within the building, then the ability of that building to support a stay-put strategy. But what I'd emphasise is that that is a temporary position. When the work is undertaken to remove the cladding and remove that risk, then there's no reason to doubt that those buildings should be able to move back safely to a stay-put position, and we have had a number of buildings across London that moved to that interim arrangement and have now gone back to a stay-put strategy.
How many buildings, what proportion of buildings are still in the
I
simultaneous
believe
evacuation?
currently it's around 130 buildings are operating with a simultaneous evacuation strategy. But
130?
About 130 currently. But that number moves almost on a daily basis, where we revisit buildings to check that the remediation work has been taken place, and obviously as new buildings come to light and we put new measures in place.
Okay. So I think we've got a feel for some of the new pressures that Fire Brigade's facing since Grenfell. Can you give us some more information about that? I think you already mentioned community reassurance, and perhaps you could give an indication of what you've been doing, particularly on community reassurance as well.
I've got a few things here. So you'll be aware of our fire cadet schemes and our life schemes as sort of youth intervention, youth reassurance. So we've run some dedicated life programs, single-day workshops with some of the community groups within K&C to provide that reassurance. Some of our staff have now undertaken trauma training to understand the impact of traumatic events on young people, to then be able to go and do schools visits and work with young people in those communities to provide that reassurance. In terms of home fire safety visits, so something that we do routinely, in the aftermath of Grenfell we saw an upsurge in the demand for those. And I think that's another measure where we've been getting into people's homes, providing not just the opportunity to provide extra alarms and coverage within people's homes within rooms of risk, but equally to provide that vital information to prevent people from having fires in the first place.
Okay. And I think it's a question for everybody now. The government's building safety programme, does it go far enough to ensure residents are safe and feel safe? I suppose the answer to that's going to be no, isn't it?
I attend one of those panels. I mean, there's a big job to do. Clearly, I don't think the terms of reference of that group were clear right from the start. Certainly not to the rest of the fire sector. There might be a small group within that panel that understood what the terms of reference were. I think there are many of us who are still surprised that it's still sitting. The fact that we've had so much confusing and conflicting advice, I don't think has helped. And I think it's probably come back to the question that you had about why don't we know more about the private sector. And I think one of the reasons we don't know about the private sector is that I think there is a reluctance from the private sector to hold its hand up, because it doesn't know exactly what the implications are. And until we get some clear advice, I think, from government, we get a change in the building regulations. We're going to get a building regulations review. I think the clarification document, I think, has been released today, against some months after Dame Judith Hackett originally said that there were some problems there. And I haven't seen the document, but I'll be interested to see what it says for the advice on cladding, for example, which has been one of the areas which has been highlighted as particularly confusing. So I would have liked to have seen more definitive advice from that group, and I think I would have liked to have seen an early action for an announcement of a building regulations review. Again, I think there was an expectation, particularly from the public, that, and we certainly saw it from the press, that Dame Judith Hackett's review of building regulations would have been actually a full review of the approved documents. It was clearly something that fell quite short of that, and as Gary's pointed out, it was silent on things like cladding. It was going for a safety case, which I think most safety professionals can understand, but of course the whole point of the of some of the issues that have been brought up post-Grenfell was how confusing those approved documents are to those even within the sector, and there seems to be quite a lot of debate about interpretation of some of the specifics within, again particularly around cladding within the approved documents. So I think that we need to see clear and decisive leadership, as soon as we possibly can now. 14, 15 months after Grenfell Tower, we need to start to see something moving, I think.
Okay, what's that something?
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think one of the issues, we've been working very closely actually with MHCLG on the building safety programme behind the scenes, and one of our concerns immediately post-Grenfell was actually the private sector, not just the public sector, and looking at holistically at buildings, not just about the ACM cladding and the combustible insulation. So as you know, they've been trying to get data on the number of private buildings, and that's really where they've run into difficulties, because we know from confidential phone calls we've been fielding ourselves at our dedicated team at the RICS, where people have said we think we have ACM cladding, but we don't want to tell the government about it. So there's an issue there where some of these institutional owners don't really want to disclose the fact that they might have a really expensive problem on their hands. They don't really know how they're going to resolve it either. So there is a big issue, and if you look at the latest stats that have just come out, the June statistics, the number of buildings that have got ACM cladding suddenly rocketed in the private sector, which we've been saying for a long, long time. The official figure was around about 300 for many, many months, and we kept saying the real figure was probably nearly double that across the UK as a whole.
When do you think there are?
We think it's nearly 600. It's nowhere near the 318, I think it was, at the last count, in terms of the official figures, simply because we know of many, many landlords who are still in the process of having their ACM cladding tested. There's a backlog at the BRE, which is quite well publicised, and some building owners, as I say, are very reluctant to even get their cladding tested. So working as a multi-agency sort of task force on this, we've been trying to get boots on the ground to actually check on buildings where we think there's an issue. The difficulty is, of course, to any...
We being the RICS?
The RICS, yeah. The difficulty is that to a surveyor or engineer, you can't just say from the outside of looking at a building that this is an ACM clad building. It's very, very difficult until you take a panel off, and if it's a private building, you can't go marching up and take a panel off and have it tested. So there is an issue, definitely, in the private sector, and it affects valuation. You've probably seen in the media around the valuation issues with some of these flats where they've been downgraded in terms of valuation because the valuer can't get information about the testing of the cladding. There's a suspicion it may have ACM cladding, but they don't know, and therefore the flats are being downvalued. So there's a massive issue there, and there's no real silver bullet to that either. So the 400 million which has been set aside for the public sector is great, but in the private sector we think the problem is much, much bigger.
How many of those 600 are in London?
Oh, I off the top of my head, I don't know. That would be plucking at straws to tell you. But that's roughly what we think is the number across the whole of the UK. Obviously, there's a problem in Birmingham, Manchester, and other big conurbations as well.
It does sound as though some of the owners are playing a bit fast and loose with the safety of their residents.
Yeah, there's an ethical, moral issue here, actually. And so we've said to RICS members, if RICS members are involved in any of these, then obviously they have a duty to disclose. But of course, RICS members are actually few and far between in terms of managing these buildings. Often you'll find that, and this is one of the issues we found post-Grenfell, is that block managers are often running many hundreds of blocks and often weren't even aware of their responsibilities under the RRO, for example. So there's an issue there where unqualified block managers weren't aware of their responsibilities, and then are not aware of actually what they should be doing either. So, and the clarity of guidance on the cladding has just continued that confusion, I think, for some time.
And we've got the 400 million, but I suspect that's going to be woefully inadequate. I mean, we heard from the chair about Camden. Well, they're spending 50 million just on Camden, so it's going to go a lot higher than that, I suspect.
Hyde Housing Association have just announced a £2.5 billion procurement framework. So that kind of gives you the scale of what probably, as a country, as the UK as a whole, we're facing. So.
Yes, I think one of the assumptions that's made in the determination of populations of buildings at risk is the adequacy of the standards that determine whether a system is fit for purpose or not.
I think we're coming on to regulation and enforcement next. So I won't push on that one. My colleagues will do that. Can I come back to you,
Did you
Dan?
want to come in at this? Gareth, sorry, Gareth was...
No, to be honest, Chairman, I'm content to come after Senator Dismore. My questions off the back of that actually segue into the next section, which I'm doing anyway.
Okay, can
so
we leave
I'll
you
wait.
to the end then?
Okay.
Thank you.
So Dan, I just want to go on then to, you have the Commissioner's shopping list, for want of a better word, that's not pejorative, immediately afterwards for the extra aerials and EDBA and so forth.
Yep.
What progress has been made on procurement? I think you were supposed to be going out to tender in June on the ladders, for example.
I think that's actually just gone out now to tender for the ladders. So I think the specification has been drawn together and that has gone out for tender. I believe around now actually, it's gone out. In terms of the additional resources for fire safety, which I'll talk about because it's my area, we've worked really hard to try and structure our department now to support our IOs in light of what we would like them to do going forward. It certainly aligns with our London Safety Plan objectives of making sure we have a strong quality basis and competency for our IOs, and equally trying to draw together a support network to keep up with the pace of development and design that London has, and ensure that we can keep that relevant for our IOs. Now that's a post that we're recruiting to. We've recruited to a number of those. I think we're now in a position to actually start to recruit to more IOs as well, to move them out there, if you like, carrying out the inspections, because we've now got the structures in place to support them. I think in terms of the extended breathing apparatus, I think is another area that you may have been interested in. There is still work ongoing to understand how we can deliver that capability better across London, from currently on our fire rescue units, but equally whether there's opportunities to use support pumps to provide that arrangement. And I think what the real challenge there, of course, is understanding that it's the environment with which firefighters are asked to work rather than how much air we give them, because there are limitations to what an individual can withstand. So that's the real challenge there. It's not about just giving people an endless supply of air and then expecting them to perform superhuman feats.
Well, we had a very helpful brief from the Commissioner about the process for the EDBA, but I see that the target date is 2021 to deliver the rollout of EDBA, which does seem quite a long way off.
I think it's a very complex area. You know, we've just done some changes to our breathing apparatus procedures based on the findings of some reviews into firefighter fatalities, and we can't discount the learning from those simply to move forward at a pace that would put us in an unsafe position for our firefighters.
Okay, and then what's the timetable for the aerials?
I don't have the exact timetable here in terms of the tendering, but I think, again, the aspiration is to move forward with awarding the contract sometime in next year, and then it's the build and design delivery, which I don't have the timetable available, but we can certainly provide that to members after.
I think that would be helpful. And drones, where have we got to with drones?
I think we've carried out a pilot with the drones at the moment, and we're now looking forward to commissioning some training for some individuals to be able to put some drones out within London Fire Brigade. I think we're looking at possibly 6 drones to be deployed across London.
And there was, I think, smoke hoods for help with evacuation. Yeah,
so again, that has gone out. We're using a framework with another fire and rescue service, Devon and Somerset, to procure those smoke hoods. And again, I think we're looking for the training to start to be delivered in around October, November time, with deployment on frontline appliances towards the end of the year.
Procurement on that's going ahead?
Yes.
Okay. And then you mentioned the inspection officers. The Commissioner wanted to replace the 27 who were cut under the previous administration. How far have you got in replacing those? I'm not sure that's exactly a fair reflection of what the ask was. The ask was to provide additional resources to enhance the inspection regime. I think I've been very clear on this on a number of occasions with officers, both within the LFB as well. But what that entails is making sure we have the right systems in place to support what is a very technical area of fire safety delivery. And it would be wrong to simply put more boots on the ground and expose those officers to a very technical and changing environment without being able to support the role that we want them to take. We've taken fire safety, as you know, very, very seriously. Public safety and public reassurance is part of that. And I want to be able to reassure people in London that the officers that we put out there to check building safety are as adequately supported and trained as possible. Well, I think that goes without saying. And certainly when I was visiting, I think it was Finchley Fire Station last year, one of the watch managers indicated that he'd been doing the training at his own bat. and suggested that the brigade might like to start thinking about training some of the operational girls on the stations to the various different levels and supporting with them to do that, to help plug this gap we've got. Is that happening?
Absolutely. So I think you'll be very pleased to know we've been running the pilot for about a year now with 2 stations in the North East area, which is for firefighters to gain a basic level of understanding around building safety and fire safety regulation. And that's for firefighters to be able to, when they're out carrying out visual audits and 72D visits in their fire station's ground, that they would also be aware and attuned to what fire safety failings they may come across. I think what that brings us as a service, if we can move that forward for delivery across the whole of the service, is obviously more boots on the ground, if you like, to spot these issues. There's some joint learning between those regulatory officers that will be called upon to support the firefighters when they find issues, to share learning for our officers to understand what fire safety means to a firefighter in a firefighter's experience and what it means for firefighter safety, bringing those two units much closer together. But equally is about that reassurance from members of the public, more coverage, if you like, with our resources, and ensuring our technical officers are there to meet the challenges of more serious failings and breaches within the RO.
And I think the last one from me on this, last but one, sorry, the short one after this. It's over a year, or about a year now, since the Commissioner put in her shopping list. Have there been any additions or alterations to what she wanted in the light of what's happened over the last year, in terms of new equipment required or more equipment required?
I'm aware of no.
Okay, and the last question is, at the inquiry, it's quite clear that a lot of the firefighters who've been given quite a hard time, to put it neutrally. What support are they getting when they've finished, or even before they start?
I think the support network that's been put in place for our firefighters, I think has been reported to this committee and others before. So those arrangements are still very much in place, and they don't end the minute an individual provides evidence of that inquiry. In fact, as you've pointed out, that for some will be a reopening of wounds and scars, and only for some magnifying those issues. And so there is still ongoing support being provided through counselling and wellbeing, and we are obviously, as part of that additional bid, looking to expand our counselling and wellbeing services to ensure we have sufficient resources to meet that demand.
Good. Thank you for that. So going on, Gareth has some questions on this, and then you've got a section if you want to come.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's just picking up on a couple of points from the exchanges I've just been listening to. Firstly, it's to Mr. Strong. You mentioned about privately owned blocks that may have ACM cladding, but not wanting to disclose that because it could be an expensive problem. And you talked about there being a moral and ethical issue for them, which of course I think everyone here would accept. Is there a legal issue as well? I mean, I'm just trying to think, I don't know if you're qualified to answer that question, but if you are a private owner and you know there's ACM on your building and you don't disclose it because you're worried about the cost, whilst taking the point that Grenfell has only ever happened once, we haven't seen a fire like that since the war. If there were to be another one and cladding were to be a major contributor to that, would that not then directly lead to charges of corporate manslaughter at the very least?
Well, I'm no lawyer, but I think you're probably right. I think the Metropolitan Police would definitely be investigating charges of corporate manslaughter if somebody knew the building was dangerous and didn't do anything about it and willingly withheld that information. So, and we have fielded calls from people saying, is there any legal obligation for us to report? And it's a difficult one to answer because there's the multitude of buildings around the city that don't comply with current regulations, but because they were built 50, 100 years or so ago. But in terms of fire safety or any other types of safety, life safety, they may not still comply with the current codes. It doesn't mean they actually legally have to report it to anybody at all. So it's a difficult one. I mean, the local authorities can step in under the environmental health officer regime and say that this building is dangerous, for a multitude of reasons, like dangerous structures, for example, which they commonly do through the building control department. But it is a difficult one in terms of where do legally people stand in terms of having to report something. I don't know if any colleagues have got any views on that, but that's a difficult one to answer.
Slightly unusually, we're going to take evidence from one of the Assembly members.
Yeah, well, being a lawyer who specialises in the fire service for 20 years, I think the answer would be partly evidential. How can you prove that the building owner actually knew. But if the building owner actually knew there was a high risk of fire, and the building caught fire and people were injured or even lost property, yes, there would be civil liability. And one of the questions I would put in those circumstances is whether their public liability insurance was sufficient to meet the cost, because most public liability insurance is around £1 million. And you can be sure that the cost from Grenfell, for example, in damages are going to be a lot more than that. As far as corporate manslaughter is concerned, as you may know, I promoted the bill in Parliament on that when I was an MP, and that again would depend on the evidence, but it could well be, if people are in the know and did nothing, they could well be in that circumstance.
But it also compromised the professional indemnity insurance as well,
Yeah.
so there's a massive issue around PII cover at the moment. So anybody involved in high-rise, high-risk buildings are experiencing PII difficulties trying to arrange cover, or experiencing increases in their excesses. But if you knew something that was dangerous and then something happened, then chances are the PII insurers would just simply say you're not covered.
Presumably, as a professional body, you might drum about the brownies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
An extension of that question then to you, Dan. How much exposure has the LFB had to privately owned blocks, and have you encountered pushback along the lines of what we've just described?
We've certainly had some challenge there. I think there was a well publicised block in Greenwich that we've had issues with. I think we've tried to work as best we can to advise people. We've certainly held our line in terms of what that public safety and public reassurance message is for us, and that's been what's driven our stance on a number of premises. I think whilst it wasn't a private block, when we think back to Camden and what took place at Camden, we took a very resilient line because we wanted to be assured around building safety, and I think that has sent a very clear message across London, and we've largely been supported very, very well by building owners. I think when we have encountered that challenge, whilst we understand that it may be that we are conflicting with competent person's advice that may have been provided to the RP of that building, what we don't have are the same challenges from that as that competent person may well have for representing the RP. We have the freedom to be there to represent what we see as public safety in all its tenets, and that's about making sure that it meets our requirements as opposed to what's a convenient interpretation of legislation and regulation. And so I think that's where possibly we have found that greater challenge, is that we are pushing for public safety in the highest degree, and we don't have to make that compromise. I don't know if there's anything Nick wants to add, because you're
Just when we identify, we as London Fire Brigade identify private block, public block, whatever, if people are at risk, we will do everything we can to make them safe using the powers of the legislation that we've got. I think there's a bit talk about the oversimplification of who is the duty holder. Private blocks can be owned by a number of different management companies who own bits of the building, and identifying that has become difficult for the housing people to identify. And also there are some leaseholders who actually own the flats who do not want it known that their building may have ACM because of the price of their house or flat going down. So it's not just the owner or the person responsible who is not wanting to make it known. It's also in some cases the leaseholders themselves. But I think we can be pretty clear where London Fire Brigade know about a private block that's got ACM and has got that, we will ensure that the people in there are safe regardless of what tenure they've got.
Changing tack slightly, and it's you again, Dan. In light of Grenfell, it's obvious why people are focusing on ACM. The cladding was clearly an enormously contributive factor to the spread of that fire, but it wasn't the only one. And you talked earlier about the simultaneous evacuation procedures and where they had been implemented. And you mentioned it being in buildings that have ACM, and in our brief it says there were 101 buildings where that's happened. It's also talked about 14 buildings where bad compartmentation or evidence of bad compartmentation. Could you outline what that is? I mean, my interpretation of that may be doors on flats that aren't fireproof or missing fire doors elsewhere. Is there anything else?
I mean, we've had blocks that weren't sort of identified through the high-rise work post-Grenfell, but that came to light that there's been movement in the building such that there are gaps within the walls between flats and the ceilings and so on, where services have been run through premises and not adequately fire stopped, which has then created breaches in the compartmentation of those buildings. They're the kind of things that I was referencing when I was talking about the compartmentation issues. We have seen issues with fire doors. There's been a well-publicised issue around a particular make of fire door as well. But we've carried out some risk assessment work, which has been checked through and endorsed by the government scientists around where we see the risk of that. And of course, doors are vulnerable in that people move in and out of them, and they rely on doors being adequately maintained with closers, seals and so on. So I think where we're talking about the compartmentation issues is more within those rigid structures of the building, and we've seen those issues being compromised.
Okay.
I just interrupt and welcome. I'd just like to welcome pupils from Toravodas Primary School from Barnet. Welcome. Today we're talking about fire safety, especially in tall buildings, so welcome. Sorry, Gareth.
Thank you, Chairman. To you again, Dan. When you advise about a high-rise residential building that's got ACM cladding, and I appreciate this is now a movable feast after the last year or so, but how is the LFB working? Who are you working with to manage the risks properly and safely, and how is that going?
So we always try to meet with the responsible person for the building. As Nick has explained, in some cases that's quite a task in itself to identify somebody to do that. But broadly speaking, we've been able to achieve that. We advise the owners of the building, as per the government advice, that they should be engaging a competent person to carry out a review of their risk assessment and check the general fire precautions within the building, and also assess the risk posed by ACM where it's an ACM-clad building, and particularly where that ACM interacts with the common areas of the building, so the staircases, the escape routes, where it interacts with openings into flats, windows and doors and so on, where you could see a breach of the compartmentation as a result of that. The general view is to check, as I say, the general fire precautions, but then also the implementation of the interim measures where they're appropriate, and the appropriateness of the interpretation of those interim measures by the competent person providing advice to the responsible person for the building. Sounds a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully that made sense. What we're also checking, though, is with local crews, their knowledge and awareness of the building. We share that information with the crews around any changes to the evacuation strategy or any additional risks they need to be aware of. The crews also carry out a site visit to check the access to those buildings and the firefighting facilities that may be available to them within that building, so they can adapt their operational tactics as appropriate.
Are those visits being taken as part of the routine home fire safety visits that all crews do?
So they may combine them. It really would be down to local crews. So if we're doing an inspection of a building specifically around the fire safety, we will invite a crew along to undertake a check of the firefighting facilities in the building, and during that time they'll carry out a familiarisation visit. It may well be that residents may approach firefighters at that time, and they will carry out home fire safety visits as well.
We touched earlier on about the issue of privately owned blocks, local authority owned blocks. How many have ACM cladding on them in London?
What are we talking about now?
Local authority blocks.
Sorry?
Local authority owned blocks.
So local authority owned blocks, trying to think of the number off the top of my head, but so we've had 740 buildings that we've worked at so far. The vast majority of those, with ACM, and the vast majority of those were social housing. There are about 40 NHS properties within that as well, some student accommodation, but largely they are residential blocks of flats that were reported to us as having ACM, and then a subset of that were those that had confirmed full-scale cladding assembly failures. And I don't have the figure with me of exactly how many of those buildings are, but I certainly can provide that information if that's useful.
Yeah, I think, Chairman, if we in the usual way, write to the guests afterwards and request that information back, I think that would be quite useful. Is there a programme of replacing the cladding on those buildings that you're aware of?
We don't hold the programme for it. If we have issues with the building, then really the interim measures are in place until such time as the RP for the building can instruct somebody to undertake the remedial work. And in some cases, so certainly when we worked with Camden early, there was a programme that extended for some 48 months, I think, across those 5 blocks. But we have seen some buildings that have had the remediation work carried out in much quicker timeframes. And it really does depend on the type of system that's on those buildings, the scale to which the ACM covers the envelope of the building, because in some instances it's fairly marginal. There's small amounts of cladding, and in some instances they pose very limited risk, but equally we've had buildings with very small amounts of ACM cladding, but they've been in very critical areas of the building, and in our determination have affected the risk profile of that building and required additional measures as a result.
Are you monitoring any replacement work? So, I mean, you mentioned, I think, a figure of 740. We know about Camden. It's going to take 4 years to do their 5 tower blocks. These aren't small jobs, they're big jobs. But are you monitoring the remainder of the properties? So is Surveyors sort of keeping on top of that?
So we have the details of all the buildings where we've been to, where interim measures in place. And of course it's absolutely the interest of the building owners to get that work done as quickly as possible, because the interim measures that are being put in place in themselves have significant cost implications for the building owner. So I don't think anybody is dragging their feet in terms of getting the work done. I think where there are some pressures is the availability of suitably qualified people to provide advice around how that cladding is removed and what to replace that cladding with. And it also the availability of suitably qualified contractors to carry out that work is also a pressure. So whilst it's welcome that we've got the money there to help move this along, there will still be those supply chain issues which may have an impact on how quickly buildings can be remediated across London.
Changing tack slightly, to Jim and Gary respectively, can you set out what you believe to be the most significant gaps in the system of fire safety control, regulation and enforcement? Should we start with you, Jim?
Right, that's a very big topic. I mean, we represent really the interests of those who are pursuing business and property protection principally, and really one of the biggest issues for us is the total divorce between life safety and property protection. In some other countries, life safety is a fallout of property protection measures. Indeed, I guess very much that's how our standards used to be, quite highly prescriptive, but because that then building out of materials which are quite high performing in terms of fire, it kept people safe, and a fallout of that was quite good property protection as a result. Really, I think since 2000, we moved on to much more performance-based, as long as you can prove equivalency in what you do with the life safety performance of the former prescriptive methods, then you can sort of do what you like. And what we've seen over the years is that has actually resulted in a shedding of the passive installation of passive capability, use of high-performing materials, and in fact the use of suppression systems as well. It has enabled the production of buildings like this, the flexibility that you need to create the beautiful buildings that we need out there. And that is fire engineering in its true form. But really the flip side is it also enables value engineering, so people to come up with designs and then for it to be stripped down to the lowest factor. And really that is a very low bar. It's evacuation before collapse of the building. And that is one of the biggest challenges we have. If you ask for nothing else, your design may be evacuation before collapse, which is not good for supporting property protection or business resilience, and it's probably not people's understanding of what the rules are supporting either. And so it can prevent people from actually making good decisions at the time of construction. And I think that's probably the unifying factor where most of our criticisms lie.
That was very interesting, actually. Gary, have you got anything you want to add to that?
Yes, if you divide it down in terms of new buildings and then existing buildings, I think in terms of new buildings, our concerns are around site supervision. So, you may come up with a beautiful design which complies with all the regulations and codes you can think of, and then actually getting it delivered on site is another matter. So as some of these buildings are being remediated right now, what we're discovering is that the design wasn't complied with. So as has been shown in the public inquiry with Grenfell, some of the fire stopping wasn't in place, which should have been in place, etc. So I think site supervision is one issue, which is a massive issue in terms of actually delivering the building which the designer set out to deliver in the first place. And with design and build, the advent of design and build away from traditional architect, procurement, contractor, build it, and supervision as we used to have 30 years ago, we've moved into design and build. And as Jim rightly says, with value engineering, where cost consultants are suggesting that you can save a shed load of money by changing something in the specification, which will still deliver you a building, but actually is perhaps not as fire safe as it could have been, as a kind of a race to the bottom. I think everybody's recognised that as a flaw in the industry. The second thing in terms of building management is where people with good intentions are coming in and putting in alterations or putting in perhaps fire alarm systems or whatever, new pipe work. Commonly in older buildings, they're putting in, replacing gas pipes, etc., copper pipes, for water, and not realising the fire safety implications of what they're doing. So the compartmentation principle, which we discussed earlier, which is a good principle, and it's worked, and it's proven to work over centuries, frankly, in terms of containing the fire within the apartment itself, works. We know that, but if it's compromised by other contractors coming in and just drilling big holes everywhere to put their pipes through, and they're not then fire sealing around the pipes and the cables, that's where you have big issues, as well as obviously things like fire doors being replaced with, PVC doors, which we see in blocks of flats quite commonly, fire door closers being removed, all that type of thing. So there's two distinct elements, I think, actually, where there are big gaps, which we've definitely been identifying, and also around the world, as we've been talking to other countries as well, what their issues are. These are common themes, not just in this country, but in other countries as well.
Jim, you want to come back?
I think there is also a problem with scope. Really, our approved documents are really about fires starting inside rooms and not letting them spread to other rooms. But increasingly we're seeing with the sort of modern methods of construction and the use of some combustible materials on the outsides of buildings, we're seeing fire ingress happening. And it's very difficult to address those within codes which just not in scope and can't be considered.
So is the current fire testing and assessment, is it fit for purpose anymore?
We conducted on behalf of the Association of British Insurers and Risk Authority just a review of the cladding standards, and we conducted a number of quite large-scale tests, really just having a fresh eyes look at their validity. And there are certainly things that we would challenge that need looking at. How valid they are, I think some further research is required, but there are certainly an issue in the first place is that too little testing is done. It is remarkable how little testing was done and what a great reliance there was on desktop studies to infer the systems were appropriate from testings that, through a process of almost Chinese whispers, become quite distant from what goes on in the building at the end of the day. But there are sort of features which we would like to see, common features which we might like to see in the test. And also there's a basic assumption. I mean, really, in accepting that we have fires, we're accepting an imperfect world. But when we come to testing building products, we're assuming absolute perfection. And really, these things are, without any wear and tear. They're not tested for the how they might respond over time. So we feel there are some areas that need addressing. We have submitted quite a large report on this, and BSI have thankfully responded by reopening the group to look at specifically the 8414 test for cladding.
Have you made any recommendations in that report apart from the cladding? For a long time we've campaigned for enhancements in other areas, particularly to do with sprinkler provision. We write the UK sprinkler rules for commercial premises, and obviously are great supporters of sprinklers where they can, where they are fit and appropriate to use. But also on enhanced detection. Really, the detection systems that we have in buildings currently, we would consider not fit for purpose. They're very hair trigger. They trigger on many other things than fire. And this causes great challenges for the fire service, who are having to adopt many methods for automatically generated alarms when you have in excess of 95%, 96% of them being false or unwanted. False being nothing to do with fire, maybe shower steam or fault, and unwanted being smoking or burning toast. But there are, with very little price differential, almost insignificant price differential, devices which could be specified, which are much more discerning. And from the research we've done, we feel overnight a change of specification to these high integrity devices could change the world from being, or these automatically generated alarms being 96% likelihood of being false or unwanted, to being 80% of probably it's a fire. And that would change the world on its head for all the stakeholders, fire service, insurers who put no value in whatsoever, or little value, I would say, and also to the owners themselves and the occupiers of buildings to make something believable. It seems like a small ask, but we try repeatedly to get it, but without success. Where's the blocking point?
There are some challenges to do with standards, in that we have a suite of standards which test for when detectors should operate, but there is no accompanying test program for immunity of things they shouldn't operate against. really we do need to make progress there so that these can be introduced in a meaningful way.
Okay. Dan, back to you. Recent events have highlighted the importance of fire safety audits, which you guys have been doing. What changes, if any, are needed to the fire safety audit regime?
So I think we talked, I mentioned it a couple of times in our last London Safety Plan about how we wanted to refocus on risk. So it is a risk-based inspection programme. It relies to some extent on the risk matrix that was devised around the time the RRO came into play, but we also look at trends that we see emerging from fire data, from what we learned from our post-fire audits, investigation, what we learn from the engineered environment, and what we pick up from residents and others that point out issues to us. So those things are useful. In terms of identifying the types of building that are more likely to be involved and whether or not we consider more appropriately the vulnerability of the people that use and live in those buildings. I think that's where we see the more immediate risk to life and where we see the high proportions of people suffering injury or death as a result of fire. It's targeted around their vulnerability rather than the type of building. So trying to put people at the centre of that approach, I think, is much more focus and importance to us. That will mean that we need to engage better with RPs in terms of understanding the profile of people within buildings. It's a more joined up approach to how we do our home fire safety visits as well. So it's to make sure we consider within that the safe and well aspects of the people within those premises. So we don't simply provide standard advice around fire prevention. We think about much more bespoke advice relevant to the risk posed by the vulnerabilities of those people.
Now, a fire safety audit is not as in-depth as an inspection, is it?
No.
Could you outline the key differences between the two?
I think it's probably better if I hand over to Nick on that one, as that's somebody who's actually done that role.
Yeah, the major difference in the role is an inspection is where the fire safety inspecting officer determines the suitability and compliance of the building by physically, intrusively inspecting stuff, whereas an audit is much more of a sample of the building and the responsible person demonstrates by sometimes other evidence, i.e. documentation, that the building is safe. So historically, if we go back to prior to the RO, it was the fire brigade who inspected buildings and gave fire certificates. So they actually checked almost everything, lifted tiles, checked the compartmentation. The order came in and wanted to put, quite rightly, in LFB's opinion, the risk should lie with the people who own the building, but it gave them, so there was a culture change, so therefore fire safety enforcing officers, inspecting officers would only audit and get the RP to demonstrate to them that they were complying. So that's the two differences.
Now, the Commissioner has talked about enhancing the inspection regime and regulatory functions. I'm imagining, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is going to be a resourcing implication of significant proportions, isn't it?
What I meant by enhancing is giving our inspecting officers the ability to move beyond the parameters of an audit. So under the regulatory framework, we carry out an audit, as many regulators do. It's a much more light touch approach, as Nick has described. And I think what I would like to see our inspecting officers being equipped with the skills and the confidence to be able to, when there are alarms, for want of a better word, triggering in their mind around the safety of that building, they have the skills to then move forward from that audit position and take a deeper look at that building. I think we've learnt some stuff from the high-rise work that we've done since Grenfell on that. That's demonstrated that there are issues, hidden issues, that would not ordinarily be discovered by an audit. And that's no fault of the inspecting officers, that's the regime that we currently follow. So that's about enhancing it, providing that skills, that support. It's also about ensuring we've got the specialist teams in the background. So fire engineering have been a hugely integral part to the work that we've done post-Grenfell. And the ask, not just because of the changes to where we sit in the consultation arena, but the challenges and the technical advancements that are being made in building design and development in London mean that we need to have the team of specialists there to support our IOs that are doing that work on a day-to-day basis.
John, I saw you.
It's just a point. I understand exactly where Dan's coming from. This is not any criticism of the Fire and Rescue Service at all. We've got the RRO and the inspection regime has been developed under the regulatory reform order, which I perfectly understand. But it's interesting, the insurance industry still undertakes quite detailed inspections of its commercial risks by a sort of surveying force because it still sees that there is value in that. And maybe when we're looking at a new regime going forward, the fire and rescue service might look to some of that risk-based industry of insurance that is looking at a sort of more detailed inspection program on a risk-based with a risk-based approach, of course. Interestingly enough, a few years ago there was a program when Strathclyde still had its own fire and rescue service, where the insurance industry and Strathclyde Fire and Rescue Service went through some joint inspection programs. That was to improve the understanding from both sides. I think both the insurance industry and the Fire and Rescue Service found it extremely interesting, and it's a shame that it was never rolled out to the rest of the country, because I think there's about 100,000 audits of commercial premises that are done by the insurance industry every year, and I'm sure that some joint working could improve safety considerably and improve understanding.
Nick?
Yeah, so I was just going to come back on your question around about the increase in resources. It's more about, what you understand is if you want to go back to full inspections, they take a lot longer. I did the certificate on New Covent Garden back in the day. I think I was there nearly 3 weeks doing the whole site, So then if you're going to do it that way, you obviously restrict the number of inspections you can do if you don't increase the resources to our staff. So it's a balance, really. That's what I wanted to say.
Which I think is a fair point. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Andrew.
Well, just following on the point there, presumably you're talking about a Section 11D under the 47 Act that we used to have.
No, I'm talking about the Fire Precautions
Fire
Act.
Precautions
Yeah, not where we gave certificate. The limitations with the Fire Precautions Act was it only covered certain amount of premises, office, shops, railway premises, hotels and boarding houses, whereas the RO virtually covers every single building apart from a house, basically. So to make public safe, the RO's got a bigger remit, but to give you some comparisons, we had something like 108,000 certificated premises in London. As soon as the RO came in, it went up to 850,000 premises where we may have to inspect. And I think that's probably underestimated, because you could even talk of a small A and B flat. That little bit as you walk in the front door, that's no bigger than that, is technically covered by our legislation. So you could be talking in the millions, of premises that come under our legislation. So this is where, going back to Dan and the risk-based approach, making sure we use our resources to target those most at risk is where we should be focusing.
Yeah, no, Nick's just summed that up. I mean, without wishing to...
You don't welcome return to the Fire Precautions Act or the Fire Services Act?
No, I don't. I think
that you made the point earlier that the responsibility sits with the right people. If you're responsible for that building, you're responsible for the fire safety in that building. It makes sense how you leaving that to the fire and rescue service.
Policing it.
Yes, I think the issue with any self-regulation is you must have robust enforcement. People have to know if they get it wrong, the penalties and sanctions are there for those. If it becomes beneficial for them to flout the law, then human nature says they will probably do it. So what the fire safety order is designed for, basically commercial premises, I believe it's an adequate tool and it's got the sanctions. In housing, whereas there's this overlap or gap, as I prefer to call it, because we only get a little bit of it, that's where it doesn't meet the requirements to make the public safe. And the housing people, the EHOs, I'm working quite closely with them, who again say they can't assess the cladding. So you've got two pieces of legislation who can't actually deal with a serious issue. So that can't be right.
This is where we get some of these private sector landlords we heard about earlier on, ducking and diving to try and get away with it.
Yes, yeah,
Okay, really interesting section, thank you. We're going to move on now to the Hackett review. Leonie is going to ask the first set of questions.
Yes, perhaps this is the moment to bring in Dame Judith and her review, which was set up obviously this time last year in July. And a lot of people have had a lot of positive and negative things to say about what came out of the review. And this is a sort of an open question pretty much to all of you. Do you agree with her conclusions that fire safety regulations for complex and high-rise buildings are not fit for purpose? Maybe start with you, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think broadly speaking, we do welcome the review, and we've worked very, very closely, and Nick in particular. So I'll do a short opening, but I'll certainly hand over to Nick because he's been fully engaged in working through the work streams and supporting teams there to deliver some of the things we've been looking at. I suppose that the thing that strikes us as most important is to focus on competency across the whole sector. I think if there was one strand that I'm very keen to see move forward as quickly as possible, it would be that, because if everything else was less well defined, a competent person should hopefully navigate their way through, would be one way of looking at that. I think the targeting on 10 plus storey buildings is a bit narrow. When I came back to the point I made earlier about targeting risk and considering the people-centred approach to that and where vulnerabilities lie, well, we know a number of vulnerable people live in properties that are well below that threshold. I do understand the dialogue at the moment, that's a manageable number and a starting point, and I think there is an intention that what we learned from that review will roll forward to buildings outside of that brief, but I think we need to make that clearer so that we don't lose that in time and just focus on high-rise buildings, because it's not the case that we see more fire deaths and injuries in high-rise buildings. It's more about the person, the type of individual that we can reasonably target quite well, where we see a number of fire deaths and injuries, and that's not covered by that broad brief. I don't know if there will be other things that Nick can add, so I'll pass to him.
Yes, but that's definitely quite clear in the information that we've been looking at. The figures are not showing, this is from the Home Office, that fires attended in high-rise residential buildings have risen between 2009-10 and 17-18. Obviously there's been a slight uptick, but mostly it's been a massive reduction over that period of time. So that's interesting that you're commenting on that. Sorry, Lynsey, I cut in there.
Oh, Nick. Again, I think what Dan says, we probably look at it. I think the issue about competency is the key, and I think most of the industry will say the competencies are out there. The issue is there is no mandating to use them competencies. So anyone really can carry out a fire risk assessment in any type of building. There is no mandate to say you have to be on a register or be competent to do a building. I think we should be looking at, and that's what we're lobbying at, where you define these high-risk buildings, whatever they end up to be, there's got to be some kind of mandate that the certain functions, the risk-critical life safety elements, competent people from various registers and that everyone here know are out there have to be mandated. So that's the only way you can ensure it. So it's the competency is the issue, but you've got to have some regulation that says you must use them type of people.
The suggestion that there should be a joint competent authority that steps into this space, and that the way in which the regulatory framework operates, what you're saying is that would be a good thing, but it needs to be broadened out from just the buildings above the 10 storeys, and that needs to be clarified exactly how that would be mandated to function.
I think the report isn't clear, actually, the role of the JCA. It uses, it'd have to be a national it's a national issue, yet it's trying to use local fire and rescue services, so there's 45 of them, 300 local authority building control people, so I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. Obviously the work's going to start. They've just announced today that Dame Judith is being brought back to lead a panel to implement the recommendations. I think the overarching regulatory framework is required. How the JCA operates, I think we need to hear more of how they think it will work.
Okay, so the devil, as always, is going to be in the detail of how it's implemented. Okay, so I think you focus in pretty firmly on what you consider to be the most important recommendations, and I think you've also alluded to what you think could and should have been a bit stronger, and the fact that we need to clarify a lot more about how the JCA will operate. Can I just take you back to the desktop fire testing? Do you think that's something that we can really continue with?
I think the assessment in lieu of tests and the Brigade's response to the consultation that was issued recently is that these are not just tests and analysis used for cladding materials. These are used for a wide range of fire safety products. And our opinion is that if it's a well-prepared assessment with direct reference to primary test evidence, then they do have a legitimate place in terms of being used. Having said that, we do have serious concerns about the quality of the assessments that we have seen in recent history. And to prevent this, we think that there is a real need to drive that high level competency as to who should undertake these tests. A better level of scrutiny placed on reviewing the analysis and the test data that's being used, and a process of checking that what's actually being proposed actually ends up being what's put onto the building. So it's about a regime that actually is much, much tighter. Dame Judith talked about the restriction on the use of assessments in their tests, and driving that competency so that people are doing them appropriately.
So that would imply that you would need to have more checking reintroduced, I think I would say, when you've got contractors and subcontractors and the actual installation going on, to make sure that what is being installed is actually bears any resemblance to what people said they were going to install, and that whole side of things. Can I just ask you then, because you just said you would broaden it out beyond just the desktop testing of the cladding materials to any kind of fire safety testing. Obviously, one, potentially you could describe it as a sort of a knee-jerk response would be to say we should ban, the ACM. Is that something that you've been arguing for, or do you just think it's that we need to look more intensively at all materials and how they're used across the buildings, and that when the testing is done, that it's done much more competently, and that it might not just be cladding materials that we need to be looking at, saying some of these are unsuitable. It could go beyond that into other areas. I can see lots of nodding going on actually.
So just to clarify, the assessment in lieu of test is already being undertaken across a wide range of passive fire
Sure.
products, from fire doors, glazing, etc. To ban the use of assessment in lieu of test is going to significantly impact quite a large portion of the sector. In terms of cladding in particular, the London Fire Brigade's response to the open consultation that's out at the moment is that we do support a ban of the use of combustible materials on the external wall envelopes, but not just for high-rise residential buildings, but for all buildings, regardless of height.
Thank you. I'm going to pass on to a colleague now.
Just from... Oh, right. Yes. I was just going to say, has anybody got anything else on that? Okay, Flo.
Obviously, there were things that probably a lot of people thought were missed out in the review. One of them being that there were no recommendations around fire safety and suppression systems, such as sprinklers. And one of the things that Dame Judith pointed to was the 4 issues underpinning the failure of the existing regulations. One being lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, which you've already alluded to, Nick, in the JCA. And then another one being inadequate regulatory oversight, including failure to pursue enforcement. In terms of some of the things you've touched on, Nick, Lynsey and Dan, what other key issues and challenges, and specifically maybe resourcing issues and implications, do you think will arise from that for London?
I think it's around the availability of competent persons to carry out a number of roles that are looking to be supported and strengthened within the review. It's not just about throwing money, it's about having time and patience to deliver those competencies. We're in a very competitive market now for people with fire safety technical expertise. So for us within the fire service, attracting those people will be an issue. It's equally going to be an issue for other people in industry, in construction, to be able to attract the right people. So we want a quite pressing timetable on the Dame Judith Hackett review. I think that's something we'd like to push strongly for. I think it was mentioned earlier we're a year away now, and we'd like something set out. But of course there are some elements of it that will take time to deliver. Unfortunately, if only I knew such a place, I would go and buy myself some fire engineers tomorrow, but it just doesn't work like that. So I think that's something that we need to appreciate. It will take some time. I'll just pick up a little bit on what Lynsey said about the banning issue. There's a real fear for me that we move forward with a ban, and in some respects it's seen that the villain of the piece has been vanquished and we can take our foot off the gas, but actually the issue is much wider than that. And I think when I went on record and said that a ban isn't the answer, that's exactly what I was alluding to, is there is a real concern around a number of issues. It's not just about ACM cladding. We have wider concerns. We've been talking about wider concerns for a number of years. I'm relatively new to fire safety, but certainly these two individuals will tell you the pains and battles they've been through over the years on that. And so it would be a real shame if this opportunity was lost and if the impetus was lost simply because we took the view that ACM's been banned and job done. It's far from that. So I think it's about setting out a realistic timetable to deliver all that's been promised, and that includes a substantial review of the building regulations to ensure that we have a robust system of regulation, and as Nick has alluded to as well, a strong regulatory role and enforcement powers to make sure that what's being asked of people is being adhered to.
So on that, because obviously there's over 50 recommendations, so essentially where you're talking about some of the more specialist subjects and specialist technicians that would need to come in, do you think that it would be better instead of looking at those that may take a longer time to implement, there should be a shorter time scale and making sure they get that skill set right to have that whole skill?
I'm not sure it's as binary as it. I think you need to look at the complexity of the skills that we're looking for and the availability and understand what the market looks like for that. So before we start making arbitrary timetables, I think there is a whole degree of work. It's almost a project in its own right to determine what is reasonable and what is achievable. I think we want, wherever we can, to make gains as quickly as possible. As I say, I don't see the need for undue delay, but there will be areas where we'll need to accept there will be, it will take some time to deliver.
Who wants to come in?
Yeah, can I just add, there's an IRG competence subgroup, which a few of us sit on actually, which has been set up to look at the competence across a whole range of actors in this, so that everything from fire engineers through to installers, through to project managers, for example. There's 11 work groups that have been set up and are underway right now to look at the competence actually, and we're due to read, in fact the first report's just been issued by the chair of the competence subgroup. But the idea is that by February, I think it is, isn't it, we have to have the final recommendations back to the Secretary of State on competence across those 11 different professions and actors that are involved in this. So it's all players in this. It's not just fire engineers or the fire brigade. It's a number of people.
Which is good. Yeah.
Sorry, I think we have to remember that we didn't get her overnight because of that one tragic event. As Dan alluded to, London Fire Brigade have been lobbying about changes for a long time, and so it will take time to fix it. I think trying to do quick fixes and people thinking the job's done will be a bad thing. I think we look, as Dame Judy said in her report, about the whole system. You can't just cherry pick certain bits to make it right. You've got to fix the whole thing, and that will take time.
No, and rightly so. Just finally, do you think there's anything more that needs to be done to ensure the safety of high-rise residential buildings?
Well, I think one of the things that has been ignored, is around the residents group, and they play a role not just about information, but about ensuring they understand what they have to do. If you look at, I can talk about the Lacanau file, about the alterations that residents made in their own flats that caused issues. So I don't think they're aware, and I think it's about them identifying, knowing their responsibilities as well. And Dame Judith has talked about them having responsibilities and about sharing information to make sure, because we want people to feel safe in their homes, and that's a two-way thing, about them getting information about how safe they are, but how to make sure what they do not put other people at jeopardy.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't had a building regulations review in this country for 12 years. I mean, it's pathetic, really. And the way that people live, the building materials that are used have all changed considerably. Other countries have a regular building review. It's set down in statute. Australia, there's a lot of complaints. They've just moved from an annual to an every 3-year review of building regulations. 12 years and we still got no announcement. We had since the last announcement of building regulations, we've scrapped the London Building Act. Local acts don't exist anymore. It does seem to me that we need a root and branch look at what is going to make a safe city in the future. And if we don't do that, I fear we'll have another tragedy, the size of Grenfell if we're not careful.
Thank you. Well, it's a very strong recommendation. Does anybody else want to comment on this?
There's one thing to keep an eye on. There is an argument that some of the issues we see really relate to the migration of building systems from the commercial environment through into the residential one. And clearly range screen cladding really associate more with buildings like those out there than in sleeping risks that people see. And we're seeing curtain glazed walling systems now coming into the residential environment. Now, they're coming from a very heavily regulated environment. The workplace, there are generally not sleeping risks attached to them as well. Due to local acts and business continuity planning, they're most likely to be protected by sprinklers. And then they develop a lost record, if you like. And we collect statistics of these types, and we still know there are problems. But then we see the technique migrate into the residential environment without all these controls and without an impact analysis of potential consequences. And I think there's a lot more that could be done with looking to what the loss experience is. The financial loss experience is probably a very good indicator of potential safety consequences when these building techniques sort of enter the residential environment.
I was just going to add, actually, there is an organisation called the Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. And I'm the chair of the Fire and Facades Group, and we've got a bunch of researchers in universities in Melbourne and in the States who are looking at fire research around cladding systems and glazing systems, such as you've got on this building here, for example, and fire ingress. So I think what's been recognised so far is there's still an awful lot of research still required, actually. So as we build more and more skinny towers, as they're called, vertical village living, which some people advocate in cities, and we're going to see more and more of that for sure. These buildings pose fire risks as well, so we need to really understand how the fire modelling occurs, in particularly in the facades and fire ingress breaking through into the buildings, into the apartments, etc. So there's an awful lot of research we think still needs to be done.
Is there good information sharing from country to country on, because obviously we've all got the same sort of issues.
just only last week, probably this is the next item on the agenda, the International Fire Safety Standards, we just launched actually at the UN in Geneva a coalition of organisations around the world who are pledged to support this and share the information. So organisations like the NFPA in the States, which is the National Fire Protection Association, the Australians, people in other countries have come together to share best practice, actually, and make sure that we don't just work in a silo, what we think is best in the UK, and we share the best practice and the experiences of fire engineers and firefighters around the world. So it's just got going. It was just launched last Monday.
David, we're sort of merging into your final section, so if I leave it to David.
Yeah, that does bring me just on to the last section I was going to ask you about. You started talking about the international fire safety standards, and can you tell us a little bit more about that, and how do you think that will improve and bring greater consistency to fire safety and professionalism?
Well, so I think I've been heading up the RICS post-Grenfell task force. So the thing that's concerned us greatly is that across many countries across the world, they've all been looking very, very acutely at what the UK has done and how we could end up, excuse me, with a fire so large as Grenfell Tower in a sophisticated Western nation. And people have really not understood how we've ended up in such a confusion around our building regulations and the approved document B, etc., and as we've already spoken about, the BSA 414 test, which is slightly different to an FBA 285 test, and I could bore you to death with all these differences that exist around the world. But actually what we did discover as we reached out to other countries and were talking to other professional bodies and also other governments is that there is a massive inconsistency in fire safety standards. And we don't share in that community of knowledge that exists around the world, and particularly in developing nations where they may not have fire codes at all, building regulations, or even any regulatory regime. The World Bank, for example, are now supporting this initiative because they see that as a massive problem in developing nations, not just developed nations. But of course, many people have been looking at the UK, seeing that we've got it wrong, and what are we going to do about putting it right as well. So my fear is that we were just going down a bit of a bolt hole, a bit of a silo, in just thinking that we could fix our problem in the UK without using the greater expertise of our cousins in America and Australia and others that have had similar problems. We think we've got a big problem here in the UK around ACM cladding, and I mentioned 600 buildings earlier. In Australia, it's widely reported to be 8,000 buildings. So there's a massive issue in Australia. It's not just the UK that's got this. Dubai have had many fires around their cladding as well. So what we do need to do is make sure we learn from these issues, make sure we collaborate, make sure that we come together, and that's why there's this growing coalition which was just launched at the UN last week. And the idea is that we will start off with quite high-level principles of fire safety, but then start drilling down with research into things like BS 8414 compared to NFPA 285 and things like that, so that we get a much better, coherent, global, consistent standards. And also investors and governments and the public in particular, need to be reassured that when they walk into a building that is fire safe. And at the moment, I don't think we have that.
Thank you. Yes, John.
Yeah, I'm a member of the Confederation of Fire Protection Associations International. There's 35 fire protection associations around the world. And on the morning of the 14th of June last year, I flew out of Heathrow to go to a meeting of CFPA International. People around that table were absolutely astounded, as Gary said, that actually a fire of the size of Grenfell could have happened in the United Kingdom. The reason being, actually, the UK has been seen as an absolute shining example for fire safety. The work the Fire and Rescue Service have done in reducing fire deaths and injuries is absolutely revelled around the world. Everybody's talking about it, or they were before Grenfell. Since then, I think that a lot of people have looked very, very carefully at their regimes, and particularly Commonwealth countries have based their fire safety regimes around the UK. The difference is review. And as I said, Australia review theirs every 3 years. There's a recognition that building materials have changed quite rapidly, and building methods, and there's a desire for understanding. Gary said, there's a greater need for research. I think that's recognised internationally. But the fact that you're actually having a look at them every 3 or 4 years does mean that you're at least having you're bringing the problem to the open. We've seemed to have put it away in a dark cupboard and not wanted to address it. I don't know why it is. Is it because politicians thought, as far as fire was concerned, job was done? That's the way it appears to me. And the one thing that we do need to learn about this, certainly to me from international codes, is regularity of review. And that seemed to be something which certainly initially Dame Judith was moving away from. I think she recognised that there was some really good practice internationally in a final report.
Yes.
It's probably also important to recognise that fires on this scale are not uncommon in the UK. They happen, but they happen in the commercial environment, but are by and large ignored, never make the press because there's no loss of life. And I feel that a lot more could be learned from that. And when we look internationally, even for your very classic, very large warehouse fire, whilst it may only be about business and loss of property and possibly jobs, our European cousins, they will sprinkler protect anything over 3,000 square metres in size, and sometimes less, whereas in the UK it's 20,000 square metres. There are some very, very stark differences in how we operate. So our perceptions of fire between different countries are very different also as a result of this. And also the acceptability of different building products, because obviously you need to look at everything as a whole. So building products that we may say perform badly may have a very different reputation elsewhere because they will be by law sprinklered.
Very good point, thank you. Yes. Okay. Right, well, I'll pass over to the chair. Thank you.
Okay, any colleagues? No. Thank you so much. That was just so interesting. We all learnt a lot from that, you can be assured. So, just a bit of business to do before we end. Can we note, colleagues, the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from today's meeting? Agreed. Thank you. Can we note the updated work programme, including the revised meeting date of the 10th of October 2018? Note the summary of the committee's site visit to Stratford Fire Station as agreed by me as chairman under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members. Delegated authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree arrangements for any site visits, informal meetings or engagement activities before the committee's next formal meeting, and agree in relation to urgent matters only a general delegation of authority in respect to the committee's powers and functions, apart from those that cannot under the Policing and Crime Act of 2017 be delegated to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members from the close of this meeting until the committee's next formal meeting on the 10th of October. Thank you. Sorry about that. Last bit. The next meeting, as mentioned before, 10th of October 2018 at 2 p.m. in the Committee Room 5, City Hall. Okay. There's been no other business, so declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
GLA chamber